What's going on, guys? Welcome to today's episode. I'm sitting down with Tony Gentilcore, and we're going to be talking about mobility for enhanced performance. So first off, Tony, thanks so much for jumping on, man. It's great to have you.
Oh, my pleasure. It's funny. It's quite ironic that you're bringing up the idea of mobility today, given that I feel pretty stiff today or this week in general with my training. I just got back from my training session, and I was like, man, this is not a good week for me.
Yeah, exactly. So can you give a little bit of an introduction to yourself and some of the work that you've been doing, just for people who maybe aren't familiar with you?
Yes, I am a strength conditioning coach, personal trainer. I've been in the industry for a while now. I think 2002 is when I entered the industry. I worked as a commercial gym trainer for, if I remember, the first 5 years of my career. I was wandering around the commercial gym sphere, working as a personal trainer. And then in circa 2007, I helped co-found Cressy Sports Performance, just outside Boston, along with Eric Cressy and Pete Dupuis. And that was home base for me for about 8 years. And then in 2015, I decided to leave and venture off on my own. And I now own and operate a small personal training studio here in Boston, Brookline, where I mainly work with Gen Pop clients now. And but I still like to get them to kind of like lean into their inner athlete, and certainly love the idea of helping people find their confidence and strength and helping them feel better and move better. And and on top of that, I do a fair amount of writing. I may, when it's allowable, I get to do a lot of workshops and travel around the world and do that, which is always very nice. I miss doing that. I haven't been able to do that for 2 years for obvious reasons. But yeah, that's more or less my 1 minute elevator pitch of my career.
Awesome, man. I actually had no idea that you co-founded Cressy Sports Performance.
Oh yeah, I'm kind of a big deal. Yeah.
Brushing off the shoulder. Yeah, that's wild. Because I've known about you for a long time, but I guess I didn't know that aspect. So that's really cool.
Yeah, Eric and I, what happened, he and I met on the internet, like many people do nowadays. And I was, like I said, I was a trainer in the central New York area, like near the Syracuse area. And he was in Connecticut finishing, getting his master's at UConn. And, he and I had crossed paths via T Nation and various other online training platforms, and noticed that we had a lot in common. We kind of like the same things, like to train the same way. And he and I built a rapport online. And then eventually he landed a job in Ridgefield, Connecticut at a commercial gym there. And he knew I was kind of itching to get out of central New York. That's not necessarily like this mecca of personal training fortitude or anything in that area. So he and I worked together in a gym in Connecticut for about a year, and we both moved to Boston. So we were roommates for roughly 2.5 years when we eventually opened up Cressy Sports Performance. So yeah, we have a long history together for sure.
That's awesome, man. So I guess I just kind of want to root the conversation in something so people kind of know a little bit more about what we're talking about specifically, especially because terminology seems to be thrown around a lot, like very loosely in a lot of these cases. So can you sort of like just give a brief outline of what mobility is and how that might be different from like maybe flexibility and then passive versus dynamic and things like that?
Yeah. So to me, when we talk about flexibility and mobility, a lot of people use them pretty synonymously. I think I'm saying that term correctly. And to me, flexibility is more or less like passive range of motion, meaning like if I ask somebody to squat down, or actually just to squat down, when I do an assessment with people for the first time, one of my assessment protocols is I just have them stand in front of me. I say, show me a body weight squat. Some people can drop it down like it's hot and get their butt all the way down to their ankles. Other people can struggle to get to 90 degrees. And to me, that gives me an idea of their flexibility. However, their mobility is the ability to control that range of motion. So when I load them up, what are they actually able to control? So, and then we can start talking about like muscle length is actually flexibility. And then when we talk about bone structure and joints, then we talk about a little bit more of the mobility side of things. So, they're probably more similar than they are dissimilar, but a lot of it's just bordering on semantics. When we talk about passive versus active range of motion, passive range of motion is what people can do on their own. So if I have somebody lay on their back and have them do, and I stretch their hamstrings, and they're doing it on their own, that is going to be their passive range, or their active range of motion. Then when I help them, that's going to be a little bit more of their passive range of motion, like me helping them through that range of motion. So a lot of times what I try to do is I try to ascertain, do those things match? Because oftentimes people might display really poor passive range of motion, but then when I ask them to do it on their own, it might improve or it might not be the same. So certainly we're trying to figure that out during those assessments.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's kind of important to create those distinctions sometimes when we are using some of the verbiage. And it's probably not so important just for like Gen Pop or whatever, but then at the same time, in order to understand what people are talking about, it's kind of like when people say, don't eat a high protein diet because it's bad for you. And then it's like, well, that's true, but it's also false. It just depends on the context, right?
Yeah.
And so a lot of the times I think that's why these kind of conflicting pieces of information, which really aren't that conflicting, can kind of seem a little bit confusing to some people. So that definitely makes a lot of sense. I kind of wanted to start off, I guess, with discussing the relationship between mobility and performance, because it's not exactly a clear or a direct relationship. So can you kind of broaden the context a little bit to kind of get us going?
Like you mean in terms of like how, like when we're in the weight room type situation? Like how,
yes, what feel free to also venture into just like field sports and things like that. So how does someone's like, mobility, their active range of motion actually impact injury risk?
So to me, like let's take the squat, for example. So when I assess somebody's squat, again, look, they're going to stand in front of me and I'm going to say, okay, what I want you to do, assume your most comfortable stance possible. Put your hands out in front of you just as a counterbalance. And I say, show me a squat. Like what does that look like? That is, and I'm trying to see like what can they do? How much range of motion do they have? So oftentimes what I find is people may have a hard time getting to 90 degrees or even below 90 degrees. And that is an abstract number. I'm not someone that thinks everyone has to squat below parallel or ass to grass or anything like that. But again, as their coach, I want to see, okay, what kind of range of motion do they have access to? And if they out of the gate show me that they can under control with good joint mechanics, meaning they keep a neutral spine, they're not rounding their back, their knees aren't caving in, they show me a pretty deep squat. It stands to reason that, okay, we can probably go train that right away. Alternatively, if someone has a hard time getting to, let's say, 90 degrees, I think we have been programmed as an industry, and certainly people who are not in the industry have been programmed this way, to think that there's some form of mobility restriction, or that we need to stretch it out, or do like a litany or laundry list of mobility drills in order to get that mobility. Where I would argue that, okay, well, let's dig a little bit deeper. Let me put you on your back and say, okay, lay on your back. Now bend your knees 90 degrees and try to pull your knees toward your chest. Oftentimes, most people will be able to like touch their knees to their chest. And I'll tell them like, okay, listen, you're on your back. If I were to invert you 90 degrees or take this picture and flip it 90 degrees, what does that look like? It looks like a pretty deep squat. So, and I'm like, well, then it's not a mobility issue. You just proved to me that you have the range of motion, like your hips had the adequate access to this range of motion, your knees have access to the range of motion, that you have this access. So to me, that's where it's very important to find, or to differentiate that disparity between what can they do on their own, what can they do with help. Because then oftentimes as fitness professionals, we end up barking up the wrong tree. Because then if we just assume that someone can't squat to a certain depth because it's a mobility issue, then all we're doing is a bunch of hip mobility drills and hip flexor mobilizations and, stretching this and yanking on that and just having people foam roll till they're blue in the face. Whereas oftentimes I find that it really is more of a stability and strength issue, that they're, for some reason, their nervous system is kind of putting on the brakes, so they don't squat to a certain depth because it deems that they're going to hurt themselves because they don't have control over that range of motion. Then that's an important differentiation to make.
Yeah, 100%. And again, that goes back to what you were saying earlier about like the distinction between passive and active range of motion.
Yes.
To be honest, it's something you see very, very often in coaching, right? So especially for powerlifting, because it's a little bit easier to kind of understand.
Yeah.
You see someone who can't squat below parallel and they just like their squat looks like absolute garbage. All of a sudden you put it on tempo and you're like, hey, I want you to go 4 seconds down, 2 second hold. All of a sudden, boom, they hit below parallel. Their spine is in a good position. They're not like, doing a stripper squat or anything like that. And it's like, oh, you just slow things down a little bit. So
and that to me comes down like that is beautiful, because that to me is just finding their entry point. So sometimes whether it's just tempo, like doing pause, like having them pause in a certain situation and do an isometric hold, or even giving them a little external support where, okay, maybe they have to hold on to a TRX or hold on to a pole to give them that stability. So then they can kind of like learn to get down to a certain depth. Okay, then they let go of the TRX or they'll let go of the pole. And now they own that position. Now stand up. Boom, you just did a squat. So sometimes it's just proving to people that they can do something rather than harping on what they can't. And I think that's the message that I'm really trying to get across to more fitness professionals, especially when they're working with new athletes and new gen pop clients, is really trying to focus on what people can do and not what they can't. Show them success. Find their entry point. Another term I use is find their trainable menu, and then hammer the shit out of that trainable menu. And you're gonna do so much good from a psychological standpoint with them, because now a lot of people are used to trainers telling them that your adductors are tight, or you lack hip internal rotation, your ankle dorsiflexion is horrible, so we have to do all these drills to fix those and address those. Where honestly, you and I both know that shit is normal. Like nothing is going to be perfect. We don't live in textbooks where we have this unlimited access to this full range of this full spectrum of mobility. Some joints are tighter than others. Some people picked the wrong parent. Some people have past injury histories that we have to be aware of. The notion here that everyone's going to have access to this full spectrum of range of motion and mobility at all times, and if they don't, they're somehow dysfunctional or broken. I think it's just a pretty narrow-minded viewpoint.
Yeah, and to be honest, the more I think about it, the more I believe that sort of thing was kind of catalyzed by big box PT gym, like PT.
Sure. Sure.
I know when I first became a PT, I was working in a big gym, and one of the things that they would do is they'd like, oh, let's do an assessment. And then it would always be the same thing. They're like, oh, your feet are externally rotated, which means your hips are too tight. You've been sitting down too long, so your hip flexors are shortened and your glutes are too long. And it's like, that's an insane concept. It's like, oh, your this is too tight and your this is blah, blah, blah. And so we need to do all this stuff. And so it's like, it's kind of this fear mongering and demonizing, like what you said, in like these things, they're not even really imbalances. They're just like asymmetries, and an asymmetry is not even a bad thing. Like you look at a baseball player and you're going to see a massive asymmetry in their throwing arm. And it's like, is that bad? No, that's actually really beneficial performance, so long as it stays within a certain spectrum. And so I think understanding the context of a lot of these things and some of the terminology that coaches use is definitely is kind of feeding into this kind of ideology that we have these global pathologies that just seem to be, so pervasive among every single person. It's like, oh, your knee is caving in like 2 degrees and that means you have a knee valgus. And it's like, whoa. I think you're fine. But then actually something you said earlier, which I really liked as well, was talking about regressions, right? If you see some issue, you don't need to get them doing bird dogs and all this stuff. It's like, okay, maybe you can't do a squat, but let's see if you can do a goblet squat. If you can't do a barbell squat, let's see, and like going from kind of top down and regressing. Yep. So, okay, what's the most advanced thing that you can do? Because that's ultimately going to get you the best results in a lot of cases, right? Because we don't need to
Yes.
take everyone down to their hands and knees or laying on their back with a foam roller, breathing into a balloon. Oh, and by the way, that's not an attack on PRI. I'm a big fan of PRI, but that was
Oh,
just.
I am too. I am too. Yeah. No, there's.
So it's like the application.
I think it's a natural progression of any coach or trainer. I think we've all started in that mindset where, you know, we read the textbook that we have to read to get the certification that we're going for. And truthfully, when you really think about it, and I'm not the first, I can't say that this thought process is what I came up with. I forget who I heard say it first, but I absolutely leaned into it and loved it. When you think about it, a lot of these assessments that have been kind of pounded over our heads over the past 10, 15 years, when you really think about it, what the end goal of those assessments are is to sell training. So, you know, when you really think about it, like if you're say, we'll call it an intake session, assessment, whatever you want to call it. If you're a commercial gym trainer, you know, your objective is to get that individual to purchase a package of some sort that they work with you, because then you're making money. Obviously the gym is making money, and everyone's happy. So many times the purpose of these assessments that we've been programmed to do or think is super important is to show people how broken they are, and that, these are these 10 things that look at like, oh, your right shoulder's more internally rotated, or you're a little kyphotic, your thoracic spine needs more mobility. You know, your left eye is lower than your right eye. That's really weird, and we need to work on that. And, you know, and honestly, like, I gotta say, like, I can look back early in my career. I can't even imagine how many people I turned off from wanting to work with me, because I went out of my way to do nothing but show them how much of a walking ball of fail they were in their initial session with me. You know, and, you know, I had to learn just with, you know, being in the industry for a while, and just natural progression as a coach, is that this is not me saying that I don't think assessments aren't important. They obviously are. However, to me now, my assessment now as a coach is to really kind of take somebody through a rudimentary training session. You know, I want to get them moving. Like, yes, there are some things that I look at on a training table. I take out the training table. I have people lie on their back, and I take them through a basic hip scour. And I'm doing that active versus passive range of motion, active straight leg raise, hip flexion. And I'm trying to see, okay, what can they do on their own? What can they do with help from me? And I'm trying to see, is there a mismatch there? And of course, this all goes into context with their training history, their injury history, their current ability level. Are they a complete newbie? Are they an intermediate lifter? Are they a little bit more advanced? But then after that, unless somebody comes into me with a pretty significant injury history, whether it be a lower back issue, knee, shoulder, what have you, I'm really just going to start a training session and then finding that entry point. Like you said, very rarely am I going to put a barbell on somebody's back unless I know they are an advanced lifter and have 3 or more years of quote unquote good training under their belt. I'm probably not going to put a barbell on their back that day, but I will certainly have them do a goblet squat and get a feel for what they have there. And if they crush it, then okay, let's try a 2 kb front squat. And if they crush that, okay, let's try a front squat. Let's keep going. And I just try to make that initial session, initial week, make that as much of a training session as possible, so they get a little bit of a flavor of what type of stuff they can expect from me and what my coaching style is. And that really, I'm not there to tell them that they are awful at doing all these different exercises. It's like, no, my job here is to take into consideration what your goals are, take into consideration, okay, what current access do you have to this mobility spectrum, this kind of abstract concept that we're talking about? And then if you don't have it, why? Like, is it truly, a bony situation, like your anatomy, like that's just the way you're built, and like no matter how many drills we do, we're not going to get more range of motion in this joint? Or is it more of like a maybe neural tension type of thing, motor learning, central nervous type of situation, where we just have to like get you to learn to ramp up tension in these joints to gain access to that range of motion that you now can control, and then just kind of having that bleed into their training session. So I know I'm kind of ranting. I'm kind of losing my my train of thought here, but hopefully that makes sense.
No, it absolutely makes sense.
You're like, no, it doesn't.
Yeah, that's like that's a bad habit that I've developed since living.
No, that makes it all. You scared me for a second. I was like, oh shit.
No, yeah. I'm just like, I was like, what are you talking about? Are you saying yes or no? So yeah, I mean, a lot of the times when I see mobility issues, it's really just a motor control issue. It's a lot.
Yes.
It's an inability to stabilize the movement, and your body just kind of shuts off. So for anyone who's maybe not necessarily familiar, like if your body senses that you're in danger, it will actually downregulate force production. So you actually can't generate as much force. And this is seen when you're, using, let's say, squatting on a Bosu ball. Whenever you're doing training in unstable surfaces, they've actually measured this, and your force production is substantially less because it's unstable. Your body recognizes this, and it's like, hey, we are at increased risk. So it actually downregulates everything. And so if you're not able to stabilize in a movement, your body will actually kind of shut down access to it, right? Temporarily anyways, until you can actually demonstrate a lot of the times that you can do it. And it's this sort of internal safety mechanism that we have. And so a lot of the times, like what Tony's talking about, he's mentioned, stability a lot. And that's something that I really want to talk about, I guess, in the next little bit here. But one of the big things is being able to control where the range of motion is happening. So a lot of the times, if we'll take a squat, you're squatting down, you hit a certain restriction, and you feel like you can't necessarily get any better, but you need to squat below parallel for whatever reason. So it's like, okay, well, if we've run out of room in your hips, we need to gain more range of motion through our ankles. If we run out of room in your ankles and your hips, well, now we need to, create some segmental kind of range of motion through our spine. So we kind of see that little pelvic tuck, the butt wink, as people call it. And so you're going to find a way to access that range of motion. And it's not necessarily always the best. Whereas if you're braced, you're nice and stable, you can maintain that integrity of the trunk, and you just kind of force your body to open up a little bit more effectively. But again, that's a very, very difficult thing to do because it is a motor control issue, not necessarily a lack of flexibility or an immobility issue. Right. And that's kind of a bit tricky sometimes to explain to people. But then also, I think sometimes, or a lot of the times anyways for me, like, I don't necessarily do like corrective stuff. It's like the training itself should be the corrective.
Sure.
And then that's sort of my opinion, right? Like, if you have some sort of issue like bilaterally in your hips and you really struggle to stabilize or something like that, it's like, okay, well, let's maybe do a contralateral single leg dumbbell deadlift, and see how that affects things, or, whatever it might be. And it's like, that is simultaneously going to help develop whatever sort of strength characteristics you want to develop. But then it's also going to tackle, some of the corrective issues, some of the motor control issues. And so in terms of your implementation of like correctives or whatever you want to call them, how do you actually go about like identifying them and then kind of implementing them?
Yeah. Again, this really kind of my root train of thought here is, when it comes to corrective exercise, is really the client's initial health history. Again, if I have somebody coming in with a pretty extensive injury history or health history, or maybe they're just like woefully deconditioned, then I'm probably going to be a little bit more corrective-y, for lack of a better term. Yeah. That's going to be an individual where, yes, I am going to take the time to demonstrate how to do a dead bug properly, or a bird dog for that matter. I mean, those two exercises are probably two of the more butchered exercises out there, even with advanced lifters. I can't tell you how many times I've had someone come in who has a chronic history of lower back pain and has been to quite a number of physical therapists, doctors, trainers, etc. It has never really resolved their back pain. And then I say bird dog. Like, oh yeah. I do bird dogs all the time. Blah, 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 blah. And then I say, well, just show me what it looks like. And then my eyes start bleeding because I'm like, what? Like, there's just their lumbar spines moving all over the place. And it's like, part of me feels like, okay, well, I'm sure this isn't to say that they've been coached properly, but then when they go off on their own, they're just doing it incorrectly. I mean, I get it, but at the same time, it's hard for me to fathom that they've been to 5 physical therapists before me, and that they have not been coached on how to coach a dead or a bird dog or a dead bug properly. And I'm just like, whoa, like, so I will be meticulous with that in the beginning stages. And to me, when it comes to corrective exercise, the bird dog and the dead bug is kind of like a starting point for a lot of things I'd like to correct, because I'm just trying to get them to ramp up tension, really feel like getting their rib cage down, getting that canister position. So, there's that canister position versus scissor position. So by scissor position, what I mean is, rib cage, diaphragm is pointing up like towards the ceiling, and then their pelvis is pointing down towards the floor. And they have this like scissor effect with their pelvis pointing one way, the rib cage pointing another way. And that tends to be a very unstable position for a lot of people. And then they go and they try to go lift heavy things in that position. And then they wonder why, like, oh, my lower back hurts, or, I feel like I'm not getting stronger. They're not making a lot of progress. I've just found, over the years, that if I get people to lean into the more of that canister position, where you think about stacked joints, where their rib cage is stacked over their pelvis, I just find that people have a lot more success in that position. And the starting point for that position is a dead bug. Getting people to learn, okay, get that full exhale, like not this shallow, like, you listen to a lot of people do their dead bug. It's a very shallow, like, and they go very fast. But if I have them do a drawn out full exhale, like 5 to 10 second exhale, get all that air out, get that expiratory reserve out. I call it the eyeball moment. Like, they feel their abs turn on, they feel the ribs come down. And then I say, I want you to own that position. That's that braced position, canister position. I want you to really feel, because if they can't do it doing a dead bug, they're not going to have a prayer doing it when I put a barbell on their back. So it's all about to me, it's always all about context. So it's like, this is, some people will roll their eyes at a dead bug. I've had many quote unquote advanced lifters come in and roll their eyes at a dead bug. But then they're singing my praises when they see their squat numbers go up, because they're just in a better position overall to showcase their true strength, just because their joints are a little bit more stacked, and they're just in a better, more stable position. So, corrective exercise, I've really gotten out of the habit of getting too far in the weeds on that. But, far be it from me, like, again, if someone has a pretty extensive injury history, whether we are talking shoulder, lower back, knee, then a lot of times we are going to start with some, motor, it's like simple motor control, knowing where your body is in space, learning how to ramp up tension, owning positions. And then always under the context of, like, these drills are going to set the base for when we actually start loading you. So you can still stay in that safe, stable position when you're actually holding a weight on your back or pulling it off a floor, and then making sure that you're keeping your body safe.
Yeah, and that's such a great example too with the squat and the kind of that open scissor position that you mentioned, because, like, the number of times that I've heard people having back pain, hip pain, or issues getting into the hole, and how that correlates with that kind of arched lower back position.
Yeah.
It's like, that's probably one of the most common issues I see when people squat, because it's like, if you extend your low back, you're kind of tilting your pelvis forward. So now we've already reduced the amount of range of motion we can get out of the pelvis. So you're much more likely to get, well, shouldn't say much more likely, but in some cases, you're more likely to get a little bit of pinching in the hips, because you're going to run out of range of motion sooner. Beyond that, if you tilt your pelvis forward like that and flare your rib cage, we destabilize the lumbopelvic complex. So it's like your adductors now not in a good leverage position, your glutes are not in a good leverage position, and both of those are primary hip extensors, especially in the hole, right? So now we've destabilized this area, we've lengthened the muscle of the abdominals, and we don't have a good way to effectively transfer force up the chain, because we're lacking in rigidity. So it's like, then you start seeing all these problems happening, like, oh, my adductor's hurting, oh, my TFL's getting really jacked up, like someone's adductors are getting like massive, or lateral quads are getting massive, but then their glutes are just like the same size, and that's not necessarily a very indicative of anything, but like, you start kind of seeing these recurring patterns between athletes. And then all of a sudden you make a couple of little changes, like you said, the dead bug, and all of a sudden you have like 5 different things downstream that are just corrected right off the bat.
Sure.
And so,
and to me, that canister position, since you and I are kind of like going with this squat example, the canister position is for me as a coach is one of my tenets of squat technique. So when I'm coaching a squat, I mean, the internet, we like to squabble over stupid shit when it comes to squatting and deadlifting, like high bar versus low bar, hand position, where your feet should be. All that stuff doesn't matter. It does matter in the sense of like what feels best for the individual who's actually performing the lift. That's kind of how I roll when it comes to that. But when it comes to squat technique, and when I am coaching the squat with somebody, that canister position is a tenet. Like across the board, I am teaching that to everyone. Another way I put it is creating a flexion moment. It's a term I got from Greg Robbins of the Strength House. Where when they have the barbell on their back, and they unrack and they step back and they have their feet in place, and they're ready to go and descent to the hole. They take that big gulp of air and they clamp those ribs down and they create a flexion moment, that canister position, and they own that as they descend into that squat. I think you and I both found as coaches, sometimes when people complain of hip pain and lower back pain, their initial motion when they drop down into the squat is to just extend into that lower back, fall into that scissor position. And then it's just a cascade effect of like shit down and up and down the kinetic chain. You pointed to all the things that will go awry into that context. So I'm really adamant nowadays as a coach. Like that dead bug to me is super important, just from a context building standpoint, canister position. And then when we stand up, and then I load you, whether it's with a kettlebell, whether it's with a goblet squat, whether it's with a barbell on your back, you need to understand that that's the position that you own. And then you're probably going to be setting yourself up for a lot of success down the road.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, I honestly don't even know if you could point to anyone who squats with like a super arch low back, who's like,
I mean, that's where our earlier conversation comes, like the evolution of personal training and strength coach. Because I think you probably read the same articles I did in the early 2000s. Like a lot of the power lifters like arch, chest up, arch. I've never competed in powerlifting. But I do know that a lot of powerlifters, when they are competing, are wearing squat suits, which require them to arch because that's the only way they can get down to depth. And those cues don't work well for non-geared lifters, which is probably 98.2% of the population that are lifting, that are in gyms, if not more than that. So that hard arch, it's been nice to see that the evolution, like there's some really strong coaches out there, both male and female, who have really leaned into this like canister position and kind of gotten away from that really hard arch. I mean, don't get me wrong, there are still many lifters who are very successful with that, but I'm looking at the long game as a coach. Like, sure, you might be able to lift a lot of weight, but your back and knees and hips are going to hate you at some point, inevitably. I've come to find. So, why not just start teaching good squat hygiene out of the get-go?
No, 100%. So can you just touch on the efficacy of some of the more common tools and techniques that people use to increase their mobility? So I'm thinking of things like Theraguns, banded distraction, foam rolling, lacrosse balls, things like that.
Those are okay. I mean, those don't tend to be my go-to anymore. Like I'm fine with foam rolling. I've come to nowadays, I'm more of a fan of doing it after a session, just to kind of bring people down to homeostasis after like a hard, brutal training session. Than I am, I'm one of my first T Nation articles that I wrote was, I think maybe the second or third one I wrote. So I'm dating myself. This is probably like 2006, 2007. It's called Soft Tissue Work for Tough Guys, where I discussed, the foam roller is cool and all, but why don't we add a lacrosse ball or a tennis ball and really break down that scar tissue and trigger points. And, we all know that now that is a bunch of bullshit. We're not breaking down scar tissue and taking out adhesions with a lacrosse ball. That's not necessarily how it works. What we are doing is just reducing or increasing our tolerance to that pressure, and like telling the muscle to relax, like by telling digging into there, getting that Golgi tendon body to stimulate, and inevitably that muscle just kind of relax. We're not breaking down trigger points and adhesions when we're adding a foam roller or a lacrosse ball. However, I will say, far be it from me, I have many clients who feel better when they foam roll for a little bit or use a lacrosse ball in their glute or in their TFL. I've not used a Theragun personally. I don't know if you have. I have not, but to me, I'd rather, my warm up for most of my clients is to do the movement that I'm going to train that day, and then use that as the warm up. So I actually saw a great example of this on Twitter today, where I forgot the coach who put it up, but he said, "Okay, today are my athletes. Today's their squat day. Here, the two drills I like to do for this warm up is a slant board, band around knees, goblet squat." With also like a single leg drop down, kind of like not Thompson step down, Peterson step down, and doing some of the, because then he's like, because right there I'm getting their knees healthy, their hips healthy, and we're grooving the pattern of the squat to warm up to squat. So it sounds like too simple to be true, but that absolutely works. I think we've gotten into this, especially nowadays on social media, where we're trying to vie for everyone else's attention. Like, look at all these cool gadgets and tricks and mobility drills we can do to get ready to squat. Where it's like, well, I could also just have someone squat and like just, and not have it be very heavy, and just kind of turn stuff on, get their hips and knees nice and juicy, and let's go train that movement now. So, I've really simplified my approach as a coach as I've gotten older. Maybe it is my old age, but of just saying, okay, what's the main movement of the day? What is the meat and potatoes of today's session? Whether it's a deadlift, whether it's the squat, whether it's the bench press, or whether it's overhead pressing, and let's warm up doing that. So that's kind of how I've rolled with the warm up and getting people prepared for their sessions of late.
Yeah, no, and that's essentially a really similar process to what I use. I mean,
yeah.
I'll look at what the athlete's doing on that day, and just so everyone knows, like, if I say athlete, they don't need to be a competitive athlete. It's just generally what you call them. But so the client, like, if my client is doing, let's say, a bench press day or whatever, let's say they're a strength athlete or power lifter, and they're doing bench press, and it's like, okay, what do you need for bench press? Well, you need scapular stabilization.
Yeah, need lats.
Probably need some pretty decent, thoracic extension, and you need decent shoulder range of motion. So it's like, okay, what are some exercises we can do that are going to probably do a pretty decent job of tackling all those? So, like, I'm a huge fan of bottom-up kettlebell presses, bottom-up kettlebell holds, maybe like banded scaption, and I don't know, if you're really tight in the lats, doing like some
bench T-spine mobs.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like that whole warm-up is dynamic, it's active, it's increasing your core temperature. It takes 5 to 10 minutes, absolute tops.
Yes. See, I agree with you too. Like, this is not to say that, okay, I'm not doing some like hip flexor mobilizations or like adductor mobilizations and stuff like that as part of the warm up, especially on like a lower body day. I'm actually a big fan of face pulls. Like, especially holds where and I like gripless face pulls. I know you're familiar with Chad Waterbury.
Yeah, I like those too, where you have like the cuffs or whatever.
Yeah, so you're not, so for anyone listening, you're not like, when I say, you're not like actually like holding like gripping the band in your hand. It's like wrapped around the back of your wrist. So you're not, it's a gripless face pull. So the band is wrapped around the back of your wrist, and then you're pulling your hands back towards your face and pulling the band apart. So you're getting the scapular retractors, you're getting your delts nice and juicy. It's just and he described it as a way, it's a great way of like promoting joint centration. So you work on getting that glenoid humeral joint centered in that glenoid fossa. And it's just a nice way of prepping the shoulders for the heavy stuff you're going to be hoisting off your chest in about 10 minutes. So I'm right there with you in that. I'm certainly going to be doing some form of like, breaking down the movement into individual parts just to kind of prep people. But what I've gotten out of is like making it like a 15 circuit thing where they're warming up for 20 minutes. I guess the more injured somebody is, and maybe the older they are, the longer that warm up may be. But certainly I if I'm working with somebody and I only have an hour with them, and I have a client after them, it's like, I have to expedite the process here. What can I do to get them prepped as fast as possible? And just the movement itself, or at least activating the muscles that are going to be part of like the whether or not we want to call them accessory movements to the movement, can be part of the warm up. I'm actually a big fan, for lower body days, like doing like shin boxes or hip switches, anything like that. Cause right there, we're working hip, internal, external rotation. We're getting the glutes involved. And to me, those are exercises that kind of tick 5 boxes at once, rather than just one exercise that hits one little thing. So I'd rather just, pick 3, 4, 5 pretty global movements that work a lot of stuff at once. And then that's the warm up. And then we go into the meat and potatoes part of the exercise, or of the session.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. I mean, you're using one thing to kind of tackle a whole host of downstream issues. And it's kind of like, even with cueing, right? Like you get the same thing with cueing, where it's like, okay, what's one cue that I can do, or that I can say that's hopefully going to correct this, which will probably correct this and this and this and this. So kind of like minimizing things. So that definitely makes sense. I wanted to just kind of touch on one of the things you mentioned earlier when you were talking about like foam rolling, some of that stuff.
Yeah.
Because I know a lot of the research shows that a lot of those changes are pretty transient, right? So when you're foam rolling, it's only really going to last, as far as I've seen anyways, about 7 to 15 minutes. So if you have someone doing like a really long session, let's say 45 minutes of, it's like, oh, I've got a mobility day. Depending on how you're structuring that, what are your thoughts on having one day dedicated to that versus like having a much higher frequency? So let's say instead of doing a ton of it, you're doing a little bit, kind of peppered throughout every single session.
I'm actually a big fan of that, particularly the older a lifter gets. I've found that the older, I'm not 25 anymore, big surprise. I found that if I can give myself like a bonus day, where I head into the gym, and just, I don't load my spine, and I just kind of move around a little bit and kind of explore ranges of motions and ways of moving that I don't do when I have a barbell on my back, or when a barbell is in my hands. I find that, I feel better, and certainly that could be done at home too. So, one term that I've used is I call it a bloop, bloop, bloop workout. And what I mean by that is if anyone who's ever played Super Mario Brothers back in the day, when little Mario eats the mushroom and turns into big Mario and the sound goes bloop, 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 you know what I mean? To me, when I do a good mobility session, or just like a separate movement day where what I mean by that is I'll set up like 8 to 10 stations they're not loaded. They're just their activation, mobility, just general basic like movement stuff. And I just set it up in circuit fashion where, I'll have either myself or one of my clients just do that for 30 minutes and say, by the time they get through that's probably about 5 rounds, 30 minutes. They feel great. They feel like they felt like shit coming in, and they felt tight. They felt, just not great. After that bloop, bloop, bloop session, like they feel great. And the whole idea of it is just to kind of re-energize yourself, get blood flow going, and just to break a sweat a little bit and just do something. And I find like one, maybe 2 days a week of those, depending on how, the intensity of their exercise during the week, that helps quite a bit. And to me, it tends to be a little bit more palatable than saying, okay, I want you to lay on the foam roller and I want you to foam roll for 20 minutes. And then, I just find if I can make it, again, feel a little bit more like a training session, that people tend to be on board with it a little bit more, because it actually feels like training and it doesn't feel like, wimpy corrective stuff that we know we should be doing anyway. So, and another way I try to sneak it in as well is in the workout itself. So I'm sure you use the same way. You might not call them fillers. I call them fillers, where instead of, doing your split stance adductor mobilizations or working on your shoulder flexion or working on your thoracic extension or anything like that, while they're resting in between sets of deadlifts or squats or bench press, they're doing these drills that are fillers. So, they're doing something productive during their rest times. So that's another way that I sneak it in. Because to me, no one gets excited to do PRI. I mean, you and I will geek out over about it and understand that positional breathing is very important. Canister scissor position is important. Getting the nervous system to chill the fuck out is important. But no one gets excited to do it. So if I can make it seem or kind of cloak it under the guise that it kind of feels like a training session, I think the better off it's going to be.
Yeah, and sometimes I'll actually use a pretty similar thing if I'm looking to increase an athlete's work capacity. So instead of having like a purely
great, yeah,
you'll actually get them doing something a little bit more beneficial, and especially actually because you brought up a great point, like especially if someone is doing, let's say, like a sumo deadlift, right, and that does have certain mobility requirements, obviously, and if you want to do it well anyways, and so maybe they're having an issue going in there, and then in between their rest, it's like, okay, you can increase their work capacity, and you can also maybe do like a really, really slow deficit kettlebell sumo, to really just make sure we're loading up the muscles, we're feeling everything, or whatever it might be. So it's like you're simultaneously improving their work capacity, improving their mobility, but then actually it's translating to a much better performance. They could potentially put more load on the bar. They'll feel the movement better. They'll actually lock in a much more effective and efficient position. So you might even enhance performance just literally automatically because you're just a little bit more aware and you're able to recruit, I guess, your nervous system a little bit more effectively.
Sure. Yeah, it's all about prepping the nervous system. That's the key. We all know that the nervous system is running the show. So anything we can do to get that bad boy firing and at all cylinders and preparing us for that session, the better off we're going to be.
Mm-hmm. So I wanted to just kind of explore the idea of like range of motion requirements, right? Mm-hmm. Because obviously we kind of mentioned this in the beginning, like it is obviously going to be relative.
Sure.
So, I think that's something that a lot of people are maybe unsure about as well, because depending on who you're looking at, like you look at, I'm not necessarily intending to like pick on anyone, but like, let's say like animal flow kind of style training, mm-hmm. or whatever.
Yep.
Or some of the, like, I can't remember his name, but like FRC or whatever,
yep.
or something like that.
Yep.
And it's not necessarily a knock at any of them, but their whole thing is like, we need to maximize blah, blah, blah about being human. And it's like, we need, like you said in the beginning, full range of motion of everything. It's like, do we though? Is that actually?
Yeah, I see the argument there. Like, I think, I have many colleagues who have taken FRC courses, and I've dabbled in it myself a little bit. I've taken a few sessions, and I've never taken like the weekend course. I do know that certification gets you brutally sore over the course of a few days. And there's been I've applied parts of it, and because I do think it's important to be able to understand getting into end range. Like ramping up tension and end ranges of motion, because I think, especially if you're going to lift heavy stuff, being able to get into a compromising end range of motion and safely getting out of it, I think is an important skill to learn and feel if you're going to have a long career lifting heavy things. However, I totally am in line with you in that, this idea that everyone we're under this same, umbrella of like, these are what the human body, these are the range of motions of these joints, and you need to have access to all this. It's just, to me, it just doesn't make sense when we know that everyone's designed a bit differently. Like, I mean, I over the course of the past 2 or 3 years, one presentation I put on is trying to get fitness professionals to lean into this idea of asymmetries, and that, even hip structure is like, you can look at hip structures and see the difference. I mean, acetabularums are pointing in different directions. Femurs are different lengths, and femoral necks are pointing in different directions and different lengths. And, it's it just seems to me like it should be common sense that different shit is different and that people are going to have access to different ranges of motion. And our jobs as coaches is to ascertain that and to find, okay, what does this individual have access to, but in a safe manner that applies to their goals and their ability level. It's really as simple as that. Like I've never gotten too worried about, making sure that, I take this weekend course and then everyone has to fall into this umbrella of that specific parameters of that specific course. I think any competent, good coach will take all of these courses because it's all information. It's really all it is. And it's important information. And then you kind of devise your own philosophy about how people should be moving, but then understand that everyone's different. And then how, FRC applies very well to this individual, but not to this individual. Maybe this individual needs more Thorogun. I don't know. I'm just spitballing here, but I totally agree with you that we have to be careful not to pigeonhole ourselves as coaches into thinking that every person that we work with, whether they're a high level athlete or just an average gym rat, that they have to have this crazy amounts of range of motion, and if they don't, then again, they're this dysfunctional ball of fail, because that is not a useful use of our time and our mental energy.
Yeah. And so you mentioned something actually in the beginning of your response that was, I think is really, really important. So I kind of just want to reiterate it, is like, you talked about, how it is important to sometimes get into some of those end ranges, or at least close to them, so you can learn how to get in as well as get out. And I think if we do have a bit of a buffer, then that does have some sort of a protective effect on things, right? And I mean, if you're looking at ranges of motion, just like you said, it's highly contextual, right? So like, should a powerlifter be able to squat ass to grass? It's like, that's actually probably not beneficial for them in a
lot. I mean, not for them. No.
You're increasing the range of motion, you're increasing time under tension, and you're making things a little bit harder for yourself.
Yeah, right? Doing more work than they have to. So, but on the flip side of things, like I'm sure you've had individuals like this as well. They come in and they are just loosey goosey, like have like all. I mean, they're like a pretzel.
Yeah.
And then some people, oh, that's great. I would argue, actually, no, not really. Like, being too loose is dangerous too. Because again, if you might have access to all this great, crazy range of motion, but then if you're not controlling it and not keeping, and then you're going to set yourself up for a disaster there too. So, there is like this Goldilocks point where, sure. I mean, I might have somebody who's very loosey goosey. Maybe they tested high on the bait and laxity score, and that might play into why they have all these joint issues, is because they are hyperextending their elbow when they're bench pressing, or maybe when they lock out their squat, they're hyperextending their knees. Yeah, I would rather that not happen. So, a lot of that's just us as coaches teaching them, okay, this is where you should stop that movement right there. And now let's, maybe we can use some of that. That's probably where FRC would come into play. It's just like teaching these individuals, okay, get into that end range of motion now, really ramp up intensity or in tension there. So now we can learn to control and stabilize it there. That way you're probably not going to get into trouble. So that's what I mean by like getting into end ranges of motion and knowing how to get out of them. I often congratulate my clients, and when I watch them deadlift, and they might, they might hitch their lower back a little bit at lockout, or even like round their back a little bit off the floor. But then in the next rep, they correct themselves. And I'm like, see, you did it. Like you figured out what felt awry or quote unquote wrong. And you fixed it. And that they have to learn that. And that only comes with, practice, of course.
Yeah. No, for sure. And I mean, like, I guess to give a very simplistic example of kind of what you were talking about, it's like, if someone in the bench press is really, really struggling to hit their chest, like that's kind of where their capacity is in terms of range. That's a big problem, because if you start loading that up and you're struggling to get it down to your chest and you're feeling it, it's like, I don't know, man. I'd be a little worried, right? And it's like, does that mean you're going to tear your pec? No, but probably not the best situation for you. And so it's like, I think in that case, you might want a little bit of a buffer where maybe you are doing some swimmers, or maybe you are doing some, shoulder cars or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
And I think that could be a great option for that individual. Whereas the person that you're saying might do better with just a little bit more loading, cutting down the range of motion a little bit, doing,
Yes.
I don't know, a whole host of things. And so,
yeah, I mean, yeah, right. You're just finding a range of motion that they can control. So, I do that with a squat all the time where, if they, we talked about butt wink earlier, a lot of it's just having a conversation about tension and canister position. And it's never the hamstrings. I always tell oh, it's the hamstrings are tight, so that's why it's pulling them. Like, no, it's not the hamstrings. But, even if I am coaching them well and we're hitting all these big bullet points, at the end of the day, after that, I'll say, well, let's just put you in a range of motion that you can control. So we're going to squat to a box. We're going to squat to a point where you are unable to, you stop right before that tuck, and then we're going to build strength there. And then eventually maybe we'll start to inch our way down, a little bit lower. So, it's just part of being a good coach, a good, competent coach. Boxes are cool.
Yeah, no, totally. And I mean, I think that gives a lot of context into, individual mobility requirements, where it's like, how much do you need? And it's like, well, what are you actually doing?
What do people do on day? Like, I certainly, if you're working with a specific athlete, you have to know the demands of the sport. So, you brought up baseball earlier. Like, yeah, it stands to reason. Like, if you're a right-handed pitcher, you should probably have a good fair amount of total range of motion, both external and internal rotation of that throwing arm. And then it is completely normal to have more external rotation on the throwing side than the non-throwing side. And that asymmetry is perfectly healthy and fine, and you don't have to fix that. Not to mention, if you're a pitcher, you should probably have, pretty decent adductor length and hip mobility and thoracic rotation and separation of, thoracic rotation and hip rotation in the contralateral direction. I mean, you certainly have to know the demands of the sport. But if you're not working with athletes that are playing a competitive sport, then you ask people simply, what are the demands of your everyday life? If you're working with someone who works in front of a computer all day, their amplitude is pretty low. I mean, they're hunched over and they're just kind of in this little ball of flexion all day. And so with their session, I'm going to try to get them out of that and extend and move sideways and maybe do some rotational stuff. And, some clients are moms, and they're carrying their kid on one side and they're hauling this up the stairs, and, they're taking grocery carts there and there. And so if you just simply ask people what the demands are of their everyday lives, that kind of tells you what their mobility demands and needs are going to be. I know it sounds profound. I know I'm not blowing anyone's mind, of course, but I think as coaches, it's important to just really simplify things. I think we try to sound too smart all the time, and we try to wow people with big words. And, I just really think if you simplify it and speak more of the average person's language, and what do you do on a day-to-day basis from morning till when you go to bed? What are the demands of your life? Let's prepare you for that. Yeah. And I think you're gonna do great things as a coach if you just focus on that.
Yeah, man, it's funny actually. The desire to seek higher orders of complexity is such an innate human thing,
Sure. And I don't bemoan people. I mean, of course, like I said it earlier, it's all my wife. I think you've interviewed my wife before.
Yeah.
And awesome. There's a phrase that she always uses that I, sometimes I'll overhear her saying with a client. I'm not sitting in on the session, of course, but sometimes I'll just, in the pandemic, I can kind of hear things sometimes. And she'll say, it's just information.
Yeah.
That's it. I'm not so I don't belabor or bemoan any fitness professionals who seek out higher learning, and they want to learn these, PRI or FRC or whatever, periodization, undulated periodization, and how we devise programs. It's great. You should do that. but you just can't, again, you have to remember, it's just information and it's not the end all be all. And not every one thing is going to pertain to every single individual. And that just comes with practice, of course. I mean, I think, the more seasoned coaches and trainers understand that. And you start to learn, like, you start to kind of lean more into like, how are people more similar than they are dissimilar? And it's like averages. And, I think you and I would probably both agree, like training patterns is probably a little bit more better use of our time than training in particular muscle groups. And, and then just finding people's entry points on those movement patterns: hinge, squat, push, pull, carry, single leg. I think if you're just, the more you simplify that stuff and just say, okay, making sure that we're hitting these movement patterns on a weekly basis under the context of like what they have control over, what the demands are of their everyday life, understanding that not everyone's going to be in a textbook. They're going to have access to all this crazy range of motion. I think you simplify.
Yeah. And one of the things that I know a lot of people, I'm not sure if it happened, like I haven't been in a commercial gym in like easily like 5 or 6 years, right?
Yeah.
I train at like a private powerlifting club here, and I don't really have many friends who work at commercial gyms anyways. And so I don't know if it's still going on, but I remember when I was working in one, there were a lot of different like screening tests. Like there was the FMS, there were a couple other ones. I'm not too familiar with what's out there now. And they were purported to look at an individual's, or at least purported to maybe evaluate the risk of injury, right? So you kind of get a certain score. And since then, a lot of that stuff has sort of been challenged. And it's like, well, we don't really see any actual reliable evidence in terms of this being a predictive metric for injury. And I wanted to kind of get your feedback on like why that might be, because I know a lot of people talk about, you need to be more flexible or you can get injured. And it's like, obviously there is some truth to that, but can you kind of just elaborate and apply a little bit more context to why that might be the case?
Yeah. I think how I've rationalized like things like the FMS and stuff like that is I think where we get into problems with scores is that and don't get me wrong, I appreciate that they're looking at it in like a global scenario where we're trying to take the law of average of like the human population and these are the scores that kind of apply to the broadest spectrum of people. And I get it. And that, you should be able to perform a clean squat and control your spine with your hands over your head. And, the rotary stability test where it's kind of like an ipsilateral bird dog. That one, I'm like, I know maybe 2 people that have passed that screen and ever. So I'm like, what are we doing? Why are we looking at that one again? I know rotary stability is important, but not many people pass it. I don't know about you, but I haven't seen many people crush that screen. But anyway, like I think to me where I have some issue, and I took the FMS years ago. I took it, I don't know, I took both modules in one weekend. Brett Jones taught it and it was awesome. Like he's a phenomenal teacher. And I was actually very impressed that he spent the whole weekend and didn't swear once. I was very impressed by that. I was like, I can't go 10 minutes without swearing, let alone a weekend. But again, it was information. The information I thought was very valuable. But now that I'm more of a, being married to my wife, I'm more cognizant of the psychological components of the words we use and how the words we use matter. And to me, the last thing I want to do is to get people married to this idea that they're a number. Like 21 is the perfect score, but you're 16. Then they get too worried about, okay, what do I have to do to be a 21? Whereas in the FMS world, really, if you're a 2 across the board, like you're fine. Like that's kind of the goal, is to be a 2. So a 14 across the board to me is like perfect. Unfortunately, like that's just not the way the human mind works. Like if you're told that you're a 1, what do I have to do to be a 2 or a 3? And then they get so focused on passing the test rather than seeing the forest through the tree, or the trees through the forest, or however that phrase goes.
Yeah.
That we get too convoluted, and it becomes and they get too caught up on being a number rather than just looking at the bigger picture. And trainers get stuck with that too. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of how I look at any kind of screen that provides a metric or a number. I try to avoid those. I mean, I might use the screens, but I'm not devising any form of like, okay, I'm not scoring people, if that makes sense. Because I just find that if I score people, they get too caught up on the number, and I don't want them to do that. Like, I think it's important to find out what people's ability levels are on these screens. But even then, like I personally am not doing an overhead squat. I test the squat. I just don't test the overhead squat. Like, I'm just like, I don't really see a lot of real world application to that. If you're not an Olympic lifter, that I don't care. Like,
Yeah.
so, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, Daniel, but that gives you a little bit of insight, like why I tend to lean away from solely using an FMS or any kind of scoring system when I'm assessing people.
Yeah, no, it definitely does make sense. And you kind of brought up something that I think is pretty important and often overlooked, right? Like the sort of biopsychosocial aspect
Sure.
of injury. I mean, like, you might score, I can't remember exactly what it was. I think you said 21 was perfect. So let's say you score 21 on the FMS. But, you're a college student. It's extremely stressful for you right now because you're doing exams, you didn't get a whole lot of sleep, and you're dehydrated. You come in and you tweak your hamstring. It's like, okay, well, technically you shouldn't have been at risk for that, but at the same time,
Right.
like, there's so many other variables that are unpredictable, right? Like, especially football. I mean, like, you got a bunch of fucking 300-pound mongoloids just running at each other, trying to kill each other. And it's like, okay, you can't really plan for that. I don't care what
No.
your ability test says. It's like, you get hit by one of these guys, like, you might die.
I mean, sometimes shit just life and shit just happens. I mean, I ruptured my Achilles last summer. I mean, I would like to think I'm a pretty healthy dude and I'm not dysfunctional, but lo and behold, I ruptured my Achilles. So who knows? I mean, I don't think I could have done any screen or assessment that would have told me that I was prone to rupturing my Achilles. Maybe because I'm too explosive. I don't know. But yeah, I agree. Like, I don't really fall into the camp of like, these scores are going to somehow tell me the bulletproofness of individuals, because it's all a crapshoot, in my opinion. Like, I mean, again, it's information. I value the information, but it's just not that simple. I mean, it's just, we're so complex. Life is so complex to think that, oh, you're 21, you're good, you're not going to get hurt. And then likewise, I mean, I've seen people who walk in like walking disasters, like they have the worst posture possible. And that's another thing, like the whole idea of posture, like, oh, you have forward head posture, or you have rounded shoulders, so you're dysfunctional. Like, you're going to be prone to injury if you don't fix that posture. I mean, I've seen people walk in with the worst posture possible. Like, they go up against that plumb line. They are like the antithesis of that, but they've never had an injury of their life. So it's just all, I mean, you can't, I don't know. I find it hard to believe that you can say, oh, you present this, so you're absolutely more predisposed to injury. I don't know. I just think it's a bit, again, narrow-minded to think that way.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. And I totally forgot the second thing that I was going to ask, but that's okay. So honestly, we've kind of gone through a lot of the questions that I already had. Was there anything you wanted to kind of touch on, or just kind of leave the listeners with?
No, I think I hit them up. I hit everything I want to say. Like, I'm just actually looking forward to 2022 and getting out there again and presenting and doing workshops and seeing people face to face. Like, like last weekend, I actually had, I was coaching, but I had 3 trainers come in and shadow and observe. One was from the Connecticut area. One was from LA. And it was just so cool to like have people like coming around again and like asking questions, like, oh yeah, like, it was just such a nice feeling. I yearn for that in 2022. So I'm hoping that, we have something to look forward to, but yeah, I think that was a great conversation. So hopefully you and I made sense to people.
Yeah, man. No, I definitely appreciate it. It was super interesting. So where can people find you?
Home base for me would be my website, TonyGentilcore.com, and that is all my articles, blogs, social media, workshops and conferences and presentations coming up. So that would be where people could get the access to me the easiest.
Awesome. So all that stuff's going to be linked up in the show notes, guys. Make sure you check him out on Instagram and all his other social media channels. He posts lots and lots of great content. Again, Tony, thanks so much for jumping on, man. It's been great to have you here.
My pleasure. Hope to talk soon.